Hi, welcome again to the National Press Foundation. I'm Sonni Efron, and I'm really delighted to have with us Bill Marcelino, Marek Posard, and Todd Helmus from the RAND Corporation, three of RAND's top experts who are going to try to shed light on an incredibly complicated topic. Our last hour was with Vasu Jakal of Microsoft, Vice President of Security. Excuse me. And we were primarily talking about the corporate landscape and the security landscape. Now we'd like to talk also about the geopolitical aspects of this, and particularly disinformation, what the Russians are up to. And the three of you have done a fantastic amount of research actually proving empirically what the Russians have been doing and why it works. So let me start by turning this over to you, Marek, to talk about what you've discovered, what the Russians are up to, and why they are so good at this.
My name is Marek Posard. I'm a military sociologist here at the RAND Corporation, and my colleagues and I today are going to be talking a bit about cyber conflict in general. And so what we're going to do is run through some of these slides very quickly, 1 to 2 slides per person, to kind of give an overview and then open it up to conversation. If we hop to the next slide, I can give you a very kind of quick and dirty overview. Russia, their proxies, as well as other countries, there's a rhyme and a reason to how they're trying to interfere in our social and political system. In fact, if you look, there is old Soviet era theories that were developed during the Cold War that are, we believe, the intellectual basis for current Russian efforts to interfere in our elections. And essentially what they're doing is they're figuring out who dislikes whom within our society. And they're trying to exploit those social cleavages by flooding the information space to drive us to extreme positions. So there's a various different types of tactics that we've identified here, but I think the key takeaway for journalists is to not focus just on one of these tactics. Because in fact, if you just focus just on one of these particular activities, it actually might help the adversary more than highlighting this pattern. And in fact, you want to look at the intersection for these various types of activities in put together. So for example, my colleague Bill will talk about in a moment, some of our research has identified how Russia in the 2020 election has used conspiracy theories tied to Jeffrey Epstein to amplify conspiracy theories and narratives about Jeffrey Epstein's ties to leadership in the Democratic as well as the Republican Party. And what you'll see is that they'll use these amplified conspiracy narratives to then to launder other types of narratives. And then they might use hack and leak operations or false online personas to amplify this content even more. So I guess the takeaway here is to look at the whole, not the parts. If we go on to the next slide. And remember that the ultimate goal is to evoke emotional reactions in individuals and drive us to extreme positions to prevent the opportunity to build consensus on issues of public concern. And so when you study and cover these types of activities, focus on the whole, not the parts, and focus on the end goal as well too. And that might just mean caveating that these efforts are underway, not necessarily trying to assign attribution, but recognizing that there is the potential for these types of activities to exist and trying to qualify when you think that they might be existing. I'll hand it over to my colleague, Bill, who could talk a bit more on some of the results from our research. Bill?
Thanks, Marek. So we did a large-scale sort of in-time detection effort in 2020 to see if someone outside the US is messing with our election, trying to interfere. We ended up getting a large Twitter data set of about 70 million tweets from January 1 to May 31st of that year about the election. And we did a variety of data science methods to try and see, is there things in here at scale that look funny, that deserve more attention? We found 2 kinds of really problematic and malign accounts that were interacting with people. And they were both of these kinds of accounts were they were both doing things that went at both sides of the aisle. So they're both pro and anti different candidates, both pro and anti-conservative and progressive. They were working both sides of the aisle. The first kind we found were trolls. So these are basically fake persona. They look or purport to be Americans. They're in Indiana or Massachusetts, but they're actually Russian employees working in St. Petersburg, actively using these active measures to try and exacerbate problems in the US. And they're spreading all these hyper-partisan themes on both sides, meant to inflame people on both sides. The other kind we found were superconnectors. And these are networks of accounts that were either just at or like one below Twitter's limits on friend-follower ratios to try and discourage bots and botnets. And these superconnectors, besides just skirting this detection ratio for friend and followers ratios, also they would be quiet and they would just wake up suddenly in concert, spread a hashtag, for example, that worked against candidate Biden, and then go quiet again. Those ones I can't say for sure, but they look, talk, and act a lot like a botnet, a network controlled by a computer program that wakes up, spreads some information, and then goes quiet again. And this, by the way, is a bespoke effort from data, scientists, including data scientists. This is not what probably you as journalists can do, although this is helpful background, I think. I want to talk about what you can do maybe in your work. So next slide, please. So unfortunately, there are no algorithms for find the disinformation or find the fake things, right? And in fact, one of the things we found is that in all of this, human attention and someone being kind of critical suspicious is always the first step, which we can then build out to something more scalable. But here are some simple things that are available to you. They're open source and they're usable. The first, and I think kind of an obvious one, is to use reverse image search. When you see an image that seems maybe too good to be true for one side or the other side, that might be inflammatory, you can always use either Google image search backwards or TinEye to go ahead and look backwards and see, how is this being used in other places? And it might very well be that the inflammatory picture you see is actually not from a Black Lives Matter protest last year. It's from Venezuela 4 years ago. The next thing is a bot spam detection. Basically, if you put in an account at Botometer, it will give you a pretty decent, not yes or no, but more like a how suspicious, shows green, yellow, red kind of rating. And if you are logged in, if you have your own Twitter account, it'll also show you, even more interesting, the followers of the ones you put in there. Really useful. If you think an account looks funky from Twitter, put it into this. Link checking. This is really powerful. I would really recommend the CrowdTangle link checker extension for Chrome if you use Chrome. But essentially, you install this into Chrome, any link, a news story, something like that. You put it in your browser, you click on the extension, and it will tell you immediately how many times it's been shared across platforms: Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, one of the one I'm forgetting right now, Twitter. And then what's really cool is if you are logged into those, if you have a Twitter account, you're logged in. If you have a Facebook account, you're logged in. If you have a Reddit account, you're logged in. It will also show you who within those platforms shared it. You can very quickly take, say, a suspicious or a interesting link and see who shared it, how often, and what platforms. And the last thing is media bias. If you're not sure of a source and you're not sure how sort of credible it is, there's a great chance to quickly see at a glance, hey, is this a trustworthy or less or more trustworthy source or not? Thanks, over.
We also looked at some tools that journalists might be able to use in efforts to counter Russian propaganda. I understand that journalists' responsibility is reporting the news and not doing interventions, but it seems that some basic kind of tactics and things out there could certainly be helpful for society at large. I mean, one thing that certainly fits within journalists' area of responsibility is on the public warning side. We recently, Marek Posard recently just published a piece of work along with myself that looked at how audiences viewed the DHS's warning about impending Russian propaganda. The results were people really wanted to be aware that these types of things were happening out there. And research shows that public warnings about propaganda, about misinformation, about intent to mislead can be very helpful for individuals in girding them against this type of propaganda. Media literacy education is really important. And to the extent that that's helpful to include in your reporting, then it would certainly be beneficial to society. But there's growing studies that show that media literacy helps protect people against misinformation, helps them better able to distinguish fact from fiction, and improves their sort of behavior on social media channels. And we did a report ourselves that looked at showing audiences a bunch of Russian propaganda memes. And then we gave some a media literacy video and some did not get a media literacy video. And those with the media and some who saw the media literacy video actually improved their behavior on social media and their willingness to share Russian content. So that can be really helpful. To the extent that that can fit into reporting, then that would be helpful. And then finally, another big role for journalists is fact checking. There have been a growing number of studies out right now showing that fact checking, automatic corrections that platforms can use, labels that platforms can attach to content online that help identify misinformation or point audiences toward facts can be very helpful, and can again, like I said, reduce the degree to which people are vulnerable to this type of content. So a lot of tools out there that folks can use or point to or incorporate into the reporting. So next slide.
Let's open up to Q&A. Journalists, this is on the record. There will be an interactive transcript afterwards, but please go ahead and drop your questions in the chat, or you can raise your Zoom hand in the Q&A, and we will unmute you and let you ask your questions directly. So Marek, let's start with some obvious questions. So I think almost all journalists are pretty familiar with what the Russians did in 2020. Has the Russian strategy changed at all? We've gotten a little bit more media literate. Have they gotten better too? And what are we seeing them doing now?
It has. And I think the key to remember is this kind of follows the advances of technology. So the beauty with these types of efforts is you do not need to spend 20 years and millions and billions of dollars designing a weapon system. These are relatively cheap operations to run. And it works pretty well. We saw that in 2016, we saw that in 2020. And so as technology evolves, make no mistake about it, Russia's going to take advantage of these relatively cheap opportunities. A colleague of mine, Chris Paul, and I have actually written some work on the role of AI and how you can basically amplify these efforts by using artificial intelligence. And in some cases, testing out potentially in the future, various types of content in mass to see what works and what doesn't work and target it to various subgroups and populations. And I want to just add that this is not just a Russia thing. And my colleagues Todd and Bill can talk about this as well too. Iran, China, other types of countries have taken notice. Again, these are cheap operations to run. They're relatively effective. And so we should expect not just to have one or two larger powers trying to operate in the United States in the future and in other parts of the world. What they're going to start doing is you're going to start seeing countries that may not necessarily have the defense capabilities that we do or China does or Russia does to start launching these same types of efforts. So they could be happening simultaneously on different types of issue fronts that can even just add to this kind of broader trend of truth decay. I don't know if my colleagues Todd or Bill have anything else to add.
I'll throw in there that just to look at what Russia's done more recently, they have evolved. Certainly their tactics have evolved. In addition to posting content online like that Bill detected, they're also developing web pages, sort of proxy web pages, proxy news organizations. One of these organizations started up in Crimea very shortly after Russia's invasion, and they're putting out content that looks like real news stories and helping to promote people to share that fake content. And the content that they're really focused on lately is COVID-19 and vaccinations. They are doing a lot to promote disinformation on vaccinations to weaken people's support for US-made vaccines. I think ideally maybe to improve support for the Sputnik vaccine or to improve the relative favorability of that. And they've also started to work with influencers. I think everyone's aware that this last couple of months ago, they started to work in really a terribly executed campaign to get influencers in Europe to start promoting some of their anti-vax content. So
let's go back to the commercial aspect of this, because there's obviously the national interest and then there's the commercial interest. And I think it's hard for journalists to sort through all these complicated issues. So you've got Russia trying to undermine the credibility of vaccines in order to make their Sputnik vaccine presumably more marketable, more viable, and it does enhance their national prestige. Do you see a lot of just frankly disinformation for the commercial good? You trash your competitors' products and you make your own products seem better? Or do you see it more that there's more of it in the nation state sort of undermining US credibility with sort of national security goals?
Go ahead, Bill.
So I would point out that like the kind of division that you're talking about is a really American Western perspective. And if we think about like authoritarian regimes, especially like in China, those divisions don't really exist the same way. The state is entrenched in all kinds of activities. I don't think they're really sort of separable. And when we look at a lot of the activities that China is doing, for example, right now, we just released a report recently on how China and Russia are shaping just general news. So not specific disinformation, but how they're just shaping the general market of news broadly going out to help support their positions. It's just broadly, we're better, these guys are bad, look how bad the West is. And I think those things work in concert. So I don't think they're trying to specify one or the other. It's just the West is bad and untrustworthy, we're better in our way, or you can trust us more. And then they target different demographics. Thank you.
So let's go back to this question of what is disinformation and these messages. For example, right now, the Russians and the Chinese are both messaging, the US is an unreliable ally to Ukraine. Biden is meeting with the president of Ukraine today. And, that US is an unreliable ally. Chinese messaging to Taiwan, US is an unreliable ally. Could be disinformation, could be true, depending on your political point of view. How effective, first of all, how widespread is this and how effective are these messages aimed at sort of third countries and as part of the proxy war?
I would say, go ahead, Mark.
Go ahead, Todd.
Well, I would say, we don't know how effective they are per se, but the fact is they're leveraging a real life situation that has proven to be a very disastrous or at least challenging foreign policy outcome for the United States. So I don't know, it's probably a good move for them because it seems relatively believable and they're just shaping that for unique target audiences.
I would just add, I think Todd's exactly right. And I think one thing we have to remember is that this stuff works when there's a kernel of truth embedded in it. And if you have a news cycle where you have volumes of information that you have to cover and things seem plausible on its face, that's where they try to sneak in a counter narrative to launder, and potentially laundering through you, all the people who are viewing this event today. This has been a problem that the U.S. allies have had since the Cold War. It mostly was in the developing world, but what we've seen with our media landscape is that there's been these massive shifts over the last 20, 30 years. And so there's more opportunities than in the past. And I would just add that I would hypothesize that the U.S. is probably undergoing a political realignment to some degree. What it means to be Republican and Democrat is changing. So people's positions and their anchors on these issues are not as clearly defined as they might have been in the past. And those are tactical opportunities for adversaries to exploit. So you take an issue like Afghanistan and whether or not we should pull out and whether or not how we should deal with the humanitarian issue. There are nuggets of opportunities that might be truthful that one can launder in a counter narrative that can be in support of our adversaries. And I think that's where there's a tricky part of being on the lookout and not necessarily not covering the counter narrative, because none of you are mouthpieces for the US government, but making sure that you're not unintentionally becoming a mouthpiece for a foreign adversary that are trying to get at you in a covert manner.
Bill, go ahead.
So one thing I would point out is that we are not in the position of deciding what is true or what is false. Like that, I don't have that ability. It would be amazing if I did, but I don't. Todd and I recently finished a project we did for Google on scaling up the detection and understanding of conspiracy theories online over social media using some improved machine learning approaches. But I think one of the important things is that we can't say what is true or false, right? Like, and a good example would be like the origin of COVID-19. What was clearly false, over a year ago, maybe, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's not clearly false. The point is that there's this conspiracy element to it, right? A bunch of people who believe the world isn't fair to them are united in believing that there are these like dark forces hiding the truth for them. It is that nature, that conspiratorial quality, which is detectable, important, and which we think really like undercuts our sort of shared sense of truth in the world. That's a truth decay kind of thing where you're willing to believe that like there are bad guys out there who are lying to you, which I think leads to something else. And that is a big part of this is not just what our adversaries do, it's the appetite. You asked about changing tactics, and certainly they're expanding, but like a lot of the core tactics actually aren't changing. So for example, the training data we used to detect new trolls in 2020 was actual trolls from 2016. They had not changed the way they rhetorically appeal to very progressive people and very conservative people and trying to like activate or motivate or engage people's angriest emotions. Americans have an appetite for this kind of stuff. Many of us are willing to believe that that conservative over there is the devil and we should hate them, not our neighbor who we disagree with, or vice versa. And so as long as America has a appetite for things like conspiracy theories, for things like hyper-partisan news, as long as we want to share it, we as members of this group here, I think will be effective.
You said an interesting thing earlier about playing both sides of the aisle in terms of activating the anger and that emotion. Mark, you had the slide that said that, that the emotion is what makes this work. But at the same time, in your research, you had an interesting finding that if people knew that they were interacting, for example, with a Russian bot, they knew they were being played. They were much more cautious after that. Can you talk more about, first of all, how did you figure that out? And what does that mean?
So I want to first off say that this was research, qualitative research we did in the very last month leading up to the 2020 presidential election. And it was based on work that Todd led, actually, which was really cutting edge, where we actually market tested whether or not Russian propaganda worked. So what we did was we took individuals who self-identified on the survey experiment that Todd administered, who were identified as being ultra-Republican or ultra-Democrat and also hating the other side as well as independents. And we sat them down in an online focus group and then conducted individual interviews, and we showed them content, asked us what they thought of it. And what they told us was that a lot of times you could see they're trying to sort through complex issues, social issues that were divisive in our country. And when in their process and explaining that to us, what they would do is they would start assuming that someone else who had a different view than them was looking down on them. Like someone who might be like, I'm not against gay marriage, but it makes me uncomfortable because I'm an evangelical Christian, but I know people who are in favor of gay marriage are going to think I'm a bigot. And then all of a sudden you started seeing these generalizations come up that were political in nature. But we showed people this public service announcement. And then what we did is we told them this was Russian content. And it was interesting, no matter how your strong beliefs on Republicans or Democrats or Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or Donald J. Trump, nobody likes a foreign adversary showing up to Thanksgiving dinner and pick fights between family members. And that's exactly what they're doing. And I think in many cases, people don't have that anchor of a framework to understand what's going on. They will gladly hate people on the other side of the aisle if they already hate people on the other side of the aisle. They just do not want Russia or China telling them who to hate. They can do it themselves. And it's a very uniquely American, I think, kind of perspective is we can hate each other, but we don't want someone else showing up to dinner trying to tell us who we should or should not hate.
So can you talk about how journalists can use this information in their own reporting? In other words, journalists also are not in the business of saying what is true, right? So supposing that you suspect that this is a Russian bot, you look at something and it looks like a Russian bot. But then if you report, hey, this looks like a Russian bot, it looks like you're trolling for one side or the other, and you're then accused of bias in the way you're reporting this. So it's very difficult for journalists to navigate this, as I'm sure it is for researchers. Can you talk a little bit about how journalists can phrase this without sounding, too wonky like a RAND researcher? How can journalists explain this issue to the public and maintain the, fairness and objectivity that's expected while dealing with these hot button issues? It's a hard question.
I'll take a quick cut at that. I mean, I agree. I mean, journalists shouldn't be out looking online and picking out tweets and then reporting those as fake, because they might not be fake. But there's all sorts of activities, all sorts of organizations out there working to help journalists in this. Facebook releases its inauthentic behavior reports routinely, as does Twitter. Organizations like Graphica routinely publish in-depth reports on detected Russian propaganda. Of course, Bill Marcellino published a great report on this last October, detecting Russian, what looked like very propagandist type tweets. I think that's the type of stuff they should be reporting on. So, it's not, but I also think that when they're looking at their Twitter feeds and they're looking at content in their Twitter feeds, I think they should at the same time be wary that they might be getting spammed, that it might be getting trolled or botted. I get this, we get this sometimes ourselves when we put out a report, and it's, I think those are helpful tools for them to defend themselves against that type of content, to know how to respond. So that's my thought.
I would just say, based on the research, the qualitative research we did, there seems to be this odd nationalization of local politics. And I do wonder, when you cover stories, if we can somehow veer away from it. There's a lot of issues where people might be conservative or liberal or independents, or they're just not even involved in the political system. But the issues that they might be talking about, particularly at the local level, really have nothing to do with national issues. And we saw this when we interviewed Californians in our last study for the election interference work, where there were issues that affected them on a day-to-day basis. And they somehow started generalizing about Vice President Kamala Harris or President Joe Biden, or former President Donald J. Trump. And these issues had nothing to do with these national level topics. And I do wonder if there's a way that one could potentially balance, the voices of real people in their stories without kind of turning it into a national political us versus them, which then creates, I think, tactical opportunities for adversaries to kind of jump on. That doesn't mean you don't cover those topics. It just means you balance it out, so you're not making everything into an us versus them on a national level.
So the narrative of political reporting, though, is us versus them. It always has been. It's who's up, who's down, and this identifying of, on some level, who's worse. Are the Democrats worse? Are the Republicans worse? Who's using these tools in a more deceptive way, et cetera, et cetera? That has been the focus of, political reporting since I started, certainly. I asked Vasu the same question I'll ask you in terms of solutions journalism. Focuses on writing about solutions, and you talked about getting authentic voices. Can you talk more about this question of wanting to be angry and the role of solutions journalism, or people interviewing people about the anger and about the fact that the anger itself makes us vulnerable to external manipulation?
I would argue, and Todd and Bill, please chime in, anger is very similar to fear. And if you just amplify the anger, the fear might actually be the thing that kind of points you to the solution. Now, that sounds kind of hokey to say, but in reality, there's usually, if you bring down the temperature, there's usually actionable issues that one can focus on and hold people accountable for, by the way. I mean, if you look at issues of water management in California, there's probably areas where you can focus on accountability that don't really have anything to do with the national political issues. There might be state political issues, but it's not necessarily the national political realm. And I think having that balance and getting the voices of people that are from different perspectives, that are not necessarily on the fringes, but have reasonable beliefs. Like, there are people in the Republican Party who have reasonable beliefs about the role of government taxes. You may or may not agree with them, but those are reasonable beliefs in our political system. The same thing on the Democratic Party side, and those who are independents who might have a little bit of both. And I think balancing that out and not turning it into a national us versus them could be quite useful. In some ways, federalism might be our opportunity to kind of, hedge against some of these attempts. I don't know, Bill, Todd, what are your thoughts?
One of the things that I was really struck by in looking at the both 2016 data and 2020 data and the tactics involved was how parallel they are. So, for example, in 2020, the memes being shared, they were really parallel, oftentimes like the same one. Like, Jeffrey Epstein is going to be brought down and going to bring down the Democrats or the Republicans. It was the exact same thing. Or like really odious sexualized stuff against Trump women or against former First Lady Obama. And like, it's the exact same parallel technique. Or if you look at the word content, if you code it, teach a machine to code it by the emotional appeals, it was the same pattern on both sides, different issues. It was the same pattern, though, of we must urgently respond because we're threatened by this. On the conservative side, it was like Sharia law, Islamic terrorism, and the illegals. That's this whole set of fears about that. But you have to respond right now because we're in danger. The exact same pattern, our computers found the same pattern for progressive discourse, only it was we're threatened by racism in America and sort of xenophobic oppressions in America. We have to act right now. So I think it's helpful to recognize that our adversaries see us as equally manipulable, whether you're a progressive or a conservative. And so sort of being aware of that and having that framework that look at the same appeals that I'm in danger and the world is like out of control, but they're picking the button to press on me. I think it's helpful.
Let me ask a little more about your use of AI to do this, both to look at the language and to look at the trends. Vasu at last hour said that Microsoft is looking, I can't even remember the number, but the number of the analytics that they're doing on a daily basis to kind of look across at the threat landscape. How are you using AI to look at this disinformation issue?
That's a good question. So as I said earlier, there's no like algorithm for truth or like bad guy finder. What there is human beings doing work can find things that look unusual. And if we get samples of those things, we can train machines to find more of the things we've already found. Or we can say, hey, this seems wacky. Find things that are like it. And there's a lot of good work on there out there. I think what's key about this is that to do this work, you need three things. One is you need qualitative sort of human domain expertise. It just can't be computer engineers. If computer engineers do it, it's not going to work because they will not understand the things they have to look for. A second thing, though, is that human beings who are good at finding what is weird, what is threatening, what is like anomalous, need to partner with people that can do data analytics. And on that end, you need data and you need compute horsepower. And then the last thing you need is a willingness to do it. So I would point out that in our study on the 2020 election on Twitter data, we found massive numbers of accounts that are clearly suspicious, clearly bad guys, and should not have been they're not authentic. It should have been on Twitter. And my question is, why didn't Twitter find them? And the question I would ask then is, to what degree are the incentives for Twitter perverse to incentives for our democracy? So is it in Twitter's best interest or any platform's best interest to practically go out and find inauthentic accounts quickly and purge them, thereby lowering the numbers that they get to ask for in advertising dollars? Or is it in their best interest to, oh yeah, that's a good point, you found that, we'll get rid of them. Or yeah, we purged, here's 800 bad guys we purged, when really the numbers are more in the millions and ought to be detectable. So I hope there's a role for journalism to press these platforms and ask them, because they have the data, in a lot of ways, our work is trammeled or constrained by our access to data. And also too, once an account gets taken away, it's hard for me to get access to that data. Their history is erased. So you can go through the platforms if they like you. If you're maybe not threatening, they can give you access to data. But as we've seen recently, if you make one of those platforms unhappy, they will cut you off immediately. So I think there needs to be a lot more scrutiny on the platforms for what they're doing and how they make their data available to outside entities like RAND, or universities like Clemson University doing great work, Stanford. We should have more openness and transparency. Over.
Bill, are you referring to the NYU researchers who were cut off? And let's talk about that for another beat, because there's a freedom of information issue both for journalists and for scholars. What kind of freedom of information act or public disclosure of this kind of platform data do you think is reasonable or realistic? There's some mutterings in Congress about how we should have disclosure laws basically for the platforms.
So there's a lot of arguments out there. One of the ones that I have also heard is the comparison to like banking. You just can't walk into a bank and be like, oh, I'm Bill 156. I'd like to open a bank account right now. You actually have to show an ID and prove that you're a real person. There's nothing like that. And platforms, again, are adamantly against that. I think it would probably shrink the number of users dramatically and lower ad revenues, probably catastrophically for those platforms. So they don't want to verify real people. A second thing is that while there are certainly legitimate concerns about regulation, overregulation, there are competitive reasons why I, as a platform, wouldn't want to share it with everybody else. But they're asking us as a nation to say, trust me. You know, we're Google, like we give you maps. You should trust us. Well, we're Facebook. You talk to your mom on Facebook. Just trust us and let us have our own oversight. And I think there's a very clearly possible middle ground between opening up all of their data to the world and saying, here are trusted entities, federally funded research and development corporations like RAND, who are nonprofit entities and have no stake in that kind of stuff, university research centers, who could also be trusted. Like, there's a lot of middle ground between we're regulated totally and exposed totally, and oh, don't watch, you know, we're fine.
I would just add to that imagine that anyone could just write any story they want on the LA Times, just right now, make it up. And you just throw it up there. And I think this gets at the Section 230 issue, where it doesn't mean we totally like remove immunity, but it does raise issues of, do they have a little bit too much immunity? And we've seen this with child pornography, right? They don't have immunity for child pornography. They have a responsibility now that they have to remove that off their platforms quite quickly. But I also, going back to Bill's point, is these platforms make money by selling basically access to users. And presumably people want to pay for advertising to real people. And I would think it's in their investors' best interest to know that who a monthly active user is actually is a real human being and not a bunch of Russian trolls. And so I do think there is some need for accountability, particularly for these publicly traded companies, that when they put out statistics in their filings of a monthly active user, they have some kind of way to audit that those are actually real monthly active users. And again, that doesn't mean you have to disclose this to foreign regimes, for example. It doesn't mean you have to disclose this where you're operating in other countries, but it does mean that you have to have some kind of reasonable fidelity of who is actually on your platform, and that there's a way to confirm that that's actually a real person to some degree. I don't know, Todd, what do you think?
I'd be in favor of them using CAPTCHAs rather than ID cards, because some countries you have authoritarian governments who would like to get a hold of those ID cards. But yeah, I don't know. I think the challenge is detecting this content's hard. It's not easy. Yes, you could make a rule that you can't pay for ads in rubles. But then in the other angle, I mean, these platforms just have to try really hard to do this, and I'm not sure how you legislate for them to try really hard. But I agree with Bill. I mean, it's terrible. We detected this stuff, and there's you hear nothing about from Twitter about this content when it would have been as easy as a phone call for them to work through this problem set. And to be honest, Twitter tries probably more than other platforms. So as you can see, Facebook, they could find a way to help this New York researcher come up with a way of better looking at these ads, but they're not.
And the question of data permanence, that once an account is deleted, it goes away, right? Nobody is capturing that. That would seem from a research standpoint and also from a journalism standpoint to be very dangerous. What about law enforcement? If the FBI subpoenas data from a previous account that's been deleted, that might be, for example, a Russian information operation, can they get it, or is it just gone?
So I don't know any about the legal questions of subpoenas, but it's gone publicly. Twitter still has it. Facebook still has it. It's still valuable data to them. They keep it. And some partners get access to it, or they'll release portions of it that they've sort of laundered and they'll hash it so that it's not recognizable by the original names, and you can be used for testing if you have access to it. But what they do is, under the rubric or the guise of saying, oh, we got rid of 40,000 bad guy accounts, what they really did was we laundered our history. And that's a problem.
So if a Russian troll account, you mentioned all the different, in your slide, you had the trolls and then you had these super connectors. If these super connectors or trolls just change their names and relaunch themselves, can they not be through machine learning just immediately tracked down and zapped because of their characteristics?
So for example, the anomaly detection that we found useful for highlighting these superconnectors, these sort of botnets, is we first divided all the tweets up using an algorithm into communities. People interact a lot. So you find, oh, here's the Biden community, the pro-Trump community, here's the Byrne community. Like, because people interact in real life and online in these uneven ways, you can have a machine group these millions and millions of tweets into sort of meaningful social buckets. The moment that happens, these diffuse, weird patterns become crystal clear. And suddenly you can see, oh, in the Trump one, the Biden one, there's these massive amount of accounts that have a weird number of friend-follower ratios just underneath this threshold of detection. So if we can do that, Twitter can do it. And yes, Russia can rebuild those nets if they want to. Twitter should be able to press a button quickly and redo it. Now, maybe they figured it out on their own, didn't talk to us, but they didn't do it before, and I don't see any evidence of doing it now. So in theory, it is possible to build repeatable AI ways to fight back. Again, it works against their financial interests. It does not appear to be happening.
Well, and I would just say that when we talk to people in that last month before the election who are hyper-partisan, they don't really get that this is going on. People are living their lives. There's a pandemic going on. They have bills to pay. They have kids to take care of. They have sick spouses. They have elderly parents. They don't study this stuff like we do in the Beltway. And so when they take that content down and they don't really know why it was taken down, they're not paying attention, they're not going to necessarily pick up on those patterns. All they see is a piece of content for a while and then it's gone. And so one of our recommendations wasn't to say, like, keep all the content up, but maybe start rethinking, do you want to remove it right away, or do you want to actually warn people and show them examples? And that's an area, I think, of fruitful research, because right now, just taking it down, people aren't going to remember why you took that down. They still consumed it, and something else might pop up later. And going back to Bill's point, this idea of a pattern is really what I think is powerful for regular individuals to understand what's going on, because they're not paying attention to this like any of us are. This is just one thing in the many things in their life. And so understanding that pattern and using prior content that's posted to help people understand that pattern, I think, is a fruitful area of future studies.
Let me go back to disinformation for profit as opposed to national interest. I totally get your point that that for our adversaries, that's a distinction without a difference from some of the state actors. But as a commercial matter, we've seen the rise. There's been some interesting reporting by Jay Solomon and others on the use of dark PR, disinformation and dark PR to trash other people's brands, and actually hiring, service for hire of disinformation for commercial purposes. Have you all looked into that? And do you think that that could be detected in the same way that Russian or Chinese or Iranian disinformation patterns can be detected?
So I'll give a general answer, and that is, in general, if human beings do things in structured ways, like when you give grandma a thank you note, like there's a limited amount of moves you make. Thanks, grandma. Enjoy the sweater. I'll use it next winter. I'll see you soon. Love, Tony. Like those kinds of patterns can be taught to machines. So yeah, if they're doing it at scale, they're doing it like once or twice here, it's hard to detect. But if there's enough of it happening over and over again, yeah, you probably can find it. And the question is, who gets funded to do this? Who's asked to do the work? Who is given access to data to actually make it happen? That's more the question is, how do we operationalize it rather than could it be done?
Interesting. Okay. So I want to go back to the fringe, the mainstream media, the fringe media, and the targeting of various media outlets by foreign adversaries on behalf of our reporters here. So we've seen foreign adversaries targeting and hacking, the New York Times. Then we've seen foreign adversaries going after, fringy or using or creating fringy media outlets, prisonplanet.com or whatever it is. the media is seen, by the public as this big thing, but it isn't. So can you talk about the targeting of the media and how our adversaries sort of view that? What is the strategy being used against the US media? Let's start with the US, then we can talk about other countries.
One thing that we noticed in our recent report on COVID disinformation from Russia and China is really circumventing mainstream media sources. They are projecting out or finding more fringe or rare sort of outlier kinds of English language news, and they're boosting it. So for example, there was a story from a smaller outlet in Canada that was talking about worries about the vaccine and vaccine efficacy. This exact same small piece got picked up over and over again by Chinese sources, rebroadcast, got traction, and then it got picked up by more mainstream sources in Canadian news. So one of the things they do then is they find these small things or fringe things that are helpful to them. They then boost or amplify them. And that amplification can then get regular media to pick it up, because now it looks like there's 50 hits on Google. It looks legit.
So how can journalists who are covering, say, a vaccine disinformation campaign, how can they spot that? Because journalists are always going to be looking at what's trendy, right? What's popping, what's increasing, and then going to report that.
That is a hard question. One thing that would help you would be that link checking. As we talked about, like CrowdTangle, for example. If you can log in, so if you're logged into Facebook or Twitter, and then you can see not just that it's being shared a lot, but that's being shared by certain kinds of groups. If you suddenly see it's all like back the blue, this, the other thing, whatever, that can be a signal that, oh, this is like partisan or a certain group is pushing it. So I really think if you do want to do your own checking, CrowdTangle and reverse image search are just really super simple, quick, and powerful tools.
I would also say conditionalizing some of these statements. You sell clicks, right, by having a really sexy title that can kind of make a strong statement. But in reality, if you look at like the COVID-19 vaccine debate, there are experts who might have different views on whether or not it was a lab leak. And making sure that you're not necessarily just trying to make an academic report, but at least having a couple lines in there that conditionalize it based on what experts are saying and not focusing on one set of experts, because those are opportunities that adversaries then, going back to Bill's point, launder in falsehoods through other channels to highlight how there's this big cabal against you from the deep state or from the government, from private industry. And I think the more that one can conditionalize statements to make sure that it's a little bit more balanced, so it's not just saying, well, all experts think X, Y, and Z, making sure you find legitimate experts from established institutions that can kind of caveat it. So there is some degree of skepticism there. So it doesn't seem like there is this kind of consensus where there might be some more debates occurring.
Let me move from the specific to the broad geopolitical. It's often said that you've talked about the purpose is to divide us. The purpose is to sow chaos. Can you talk about how sowing chaos actually benefits foreign adversaries? I mean, the premise is that we have to be united to be strong as a country, and if we're divided, we'll be weak. But in an era where we have nuclear weapons and an army that can be deployed anywhere on the planet if the president so decrees, frankly, without even active war from the Congress, what does it really matter if we're divided or not? What are the adversaries actually getting apart from a lot of angst?
Political paralysis. Look at the January 6th insurrection. I mean, the more that you can gin people up on both sides of the issue, and I'm not saying that the Russians or Chinese or anyone was behind it, but I think it's an example of what happens when political paralysis can very openly undermine our democracy. And people get ginned up and they take action. And I think what ends up happening is we're now not paying attention to issues of public concerns, streets, taxes, issues of our foreign policy. We're not having productive debates. Instead, we're yelling at each other on Twitter. And we're basically amplifying voices that otherwise in an interaction on a one-on-one basis probably would not actually really exist or be accepted. And so in that case, we now cannot kind of focus on building consensus, which is the basically heartbeat of our democracy. And instead, we're focusing on these kind of distractions based on the extreme ends of both political spectrums. I mean, Todd's done a lot of work on extremism lately as well. I don't know what his thoughts are.
I mean, I'd just say that, I mean, number one, we're talking about Russia now. So, Russia's made themselves part of the conversation when they weren't part of the conversation. It raises their brand values, so to speak, that they didn't have before. So it's good for them on that level. They've obviously sowed distrust in our electoral system. And if there's anything that will be a downfall in this country, it'll be the utter fall of the electoral system. So, so I think that's really it. I mean, it weakens the United States. What weakens the United States as the alternative superpower and improves the stature of the other superpower, or the other superpower, so they think. So, so I think these things are good for Russia in a lot of ways.
There are also
and they don't pay a price, and they haven't paid a price. So, what's the harm?
There are specific operational and then long-term strategic benefits for Russia and for China in doing this. So, for example, like for Russia, it is really important to them to have a buffer of nations around them. Like, this is a long-standing part of their national psyche and strategy, is they want to have this buffer between them and other countries. And they have a long history of why they don't want anyone close to their borders. The US's encouragement of color revolutions was really threatening. Being able to, say, go into Ukraine, into Crimea, to go to other places and flex and create more space, while the US, while the UK and other Western nations are more distracted. It may not be the decisive thing, but it's at the margin, one more thing to keep the West from responding coherently. And so it helps give them operational room. For China, on the other hand, China's trying to move international norms, right? So China has this long-term idea of sort of super sovereignty, like China wants to be first among sovereign nations, right? Like, have a special place for the Middle Kingdom. And so if they want to be able to do things like grab islands from other countries or push what is international waters and make it their waters, they have to move what we think is true, what is a norm. And so, like, degrading truth, degrading sort of the cohesion of other countries allows them operating space to do things like grab islands, grab territory, arrest Filipino fishermen and take them off. Like, they have a lot of operating space because we're way too busy doing other things.
Last question, round of questions for you. And I want to, again, encourage people, put your questions in the chat, raise your hand, don't be shy. What stories do you want to see written in the next 6 months? What are the headlines and what are the things that journalists aren't covering that they could be covering, that they should be covering?
When you look at Russia, China, Iranian efforts, they're ridiculous. This content they produce is ridiculous. It is pretending to be super PACs to promote anti-LGBTQ stuff. It is anti-gun rights stuff. And if I could see articles being written on how ridiculous this is, that I think is a ding against Russia, China, and whatnot. And we saw this in the 80s. One of the things that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And when they start running stories on just how ridiculous some of these information efforts were, there is some evidence, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that it was embarrassing to the Soviet Union. And it was something that kind of made them look ridiculous. And so I would like to see balanced reporting and just how ridiculous these types of efforts are, and essentially like showcase how silly and foolish they are in an expose. And I think that a lot of people on the right and the left would be shocked to see how ridiculous this stuff is.
Inside information on how the platforms are addressing these issues would be really helpful. There's been really interesting reporting by MIT Technology on, for example, the AI expert at Facebook. That was really incredibly insightful. There's also been a lot of indications of discontent within Facebook about their efforts on inauthentic behavior. So more reporting on that would be helpful. And I think also, like, what is the administration doing? Like, I get it, Biden talked to Putin and said something to Putin, but what else is there? Is there a strategy? What are the agencies doing and involved on this effort? What is there a cohesive internet government response? How are we coordinating with our allies? Yeah, I would have thought that would have been happening by now with the Biden administration. I haven't seen it, so reporting on that would be helpful.
Yeah, I would love to see more sunshine and attention paid, like Todd said, on the platform and what they're doing. And that is definitely a role for the fourth estate. And I also think this idea that there is not a national strategy for dealing with adversaries who are trying to harm the US and the West, I don't understand that. And so those are good questions that reporters can ask.
And Bill, what would the elements of such a national strategy be in your mind that wouldn't be First Amendment violations, essentially, when you're dealing with disinformation?
And I want to be careful. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a First Amendment background. So what I do see a problem with is less the domestic issues, or I am less concerned in this question on like, how do you punish a domestic actor or regulate, sort of truthiness for domestic actors? That is very thorny. I have no idea what our national strategy is for how to respond to, say, a Russian-sponsored or Russian-enabled cyber attack, ransomware attack. It could be a campaign to affect the election. Like, I don't know, what are the consequences? Have we thought about how far do we go before it causes, say, something like we don't want to destabilize? Like, we don't want to like push a button and like launch some sort of like war. So like, we don't know our risk tolerance. We don't know how we respond without being escalatory. We don't have criteria for what's worth responding to. We don't have a plan going forward for addressing it. Like a national strategy would say, here's the problem, here are things we can do, and here's the end state we want to get to and how we'll get to it. We have nothing, a little bit of empty rhetoric. I'd love to see something specific for how America wants to address this and comprehensively. It's not just truth decay. It's not just ransomware attacks. Like, our adversaries are trying to compete with the US below the threshold of actual shooting. And they're really dangerous things. And as we've seen with ransomware, they have like enormous impact on us. We can't sit by and watch this happen.
I just did a report highlighting 30 some recommendations that researchers like us have levied to address this disinformation piece. That's a lot. That involves multiple agencies. That involves a lot of money from a lot of different organizations, a lot of coordination, synchronization efforts. How do you prioritize that? I mean, all that has to get synced at the NSC and at the White House before you sort of, to be able to prioritize and execute something like that.
Okay. Well, Bill Marcelino, Marek Posard, and Todd Helmus, thank you so much for being with us. This will be recorded and we look forward to talking to you more. We're going to take a short break and then we'll be back with Tom Wingfield and John Welburn to talk about ransomware and cyber conflict and the rules of the road on that. Thank you so much.